Hello, this is Mike Crowley with the Introduction to International Relations course online. Welcome. In today's lecture, we study soft power through the lens of international political economy as described in our textbook, Essentials of International Relations by Karen A. Minkst in Chapter 8. This video presentation dealing with the intersection of United States domestic policy and international political economy was recorded by Mike Crowley in Santa Rosa, California. All citations, including an annotated bibliography as well as acknowledgments of all other authors' contributions toward the formulation of this lecture, are available upon request. International political economy is the study of the interplay of economics and politics in the world arena. Over the past 20 years, the study of international political economy has gone through a remarkable resurgence. Virtually non-existent before 1970 as a field of study, international political economy is now one of the most popular areas of specialization for both undergraduates and graduate students, as well as the source of some of the most innovative and influential work by modern social scientists. The revival of IPE, after nearly 40 years of dormancy, has enriched both social and public debate and promises so to continue. For some, it refers primarily to the study of the political basis of economic actions, the ways in which government, foreign, and domestic policies affect market operations. For others, it is the opposite, the economic basis for political action, the ways in which economic forces mold government policies. The two focuses are, in a sense, complementary, for politics and markets are in a constant state of mutual interaction. Using the Trump administration's 2019 trade war with China as a relative case study, please describe IPE and its predominant perspectives, structures, and levels of analysis. We use the term global political economy instead of international political economy because not all players are nations, while most issues are inherently global. We'll come back to this second descriptive, IPE, in a few moments. The most direct answer to the question, what is political economy, is found in the name itself. Political economy suggests a focus on phenomena that lie at the crossroads of traditional fields of political science and economics. It seeks to explain how political power shapes economic outcomes and how economic forces constrain political action. We can view international political economy as the intersection of the substantive areas studied by economists, production and exchange of marketable goods and services, with the process by which power is exercised, that being the study of political science. This obviously steps on the toes of the traditional and customary domain of international relations. Indeed, the recent renaissance of IPE is in part a response to perceived shortcomings in the dominant realist or state-centric paradigm of international relations. In the post-war era, realism has tended to separate politics from economics and to define national power largely in militaristic terms. This limits the understanding of structural power in which international forces of production play an important part. We are going to be using a good many unique terms and acronyms in this class, so it's important to get them under our belt today. We're going to be covering all these again many times over, so please don't let your head explode. Just please try to take notes and get some of these critters nailed down. A quick word on the difference between nation and state and the combined term nation-state. A nation is defined as a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a country or a territory. A state is a civil government of a nation or territory manifesting as an organized political community. There are 193 countries that are members of the United Nations and are considered nation-states, and there are 2 observer states, the Holy See and Palestine. Palestine is considered one of the several stateless nations of the world. Stateless nations exist then. Other examples include the Kurds, who currently reside in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey, but have not established an internationally recognized state based on their national identity. The Jews were a stateless nation until 1948, when they declared Israel a state and immediately gained recognition from the United States, followed by the rest of the world. The Palestinians are currently a stateless nation, although the sovereignty of Palestine has been recognized by the UN. So, having said that, a term that keeps popping up in our literature in this class are transnational actors, or TNAs, used to denote an organization working beyond nation-state boundaries and acting independently from traditional state authorities. For example, some TNAs are transnational corporations, or TNCs. TNCs are any enterprise that undertakes foreign direct investment, FDI, owns or controls income-gathering assets in more than one country, produces goods or services outside its country of origin, or engages in international production. Some examples of TNCs include, ranking from the world's largest, Apple Computers, Alphabet, which owns Google, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, Amazon, Facebook, Johnson & Johnson, General Electric, and China Mobile. Further, we have economic confederations and trade blocs among nation-states, more to follow on defining that are also transnational actors, TNAs, but these are known as intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs, that allow products, services, and workers to cross borders freely. A good example of an IGO is an economic union that is aimed at eliminating internal economic, political, philosophical, and social barriers, usually by delegating political and economic authority to a central political agency, while adopting external barriers toward the free movement of resources. An economic union has a degree of economic integration that goes beyond that found in a simple customs union. Examples are the Economic and Monetary Union, also known as the Eurozone of the European Union, the Central American Common Market, that includes Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, that we've heard so much about recently again, which is the United States, Canada, and Mexico, as well as the GCC, or the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. These, then, are examples of intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs, that are also transnational actors. We also have transnational actors, TNAs, that are known as INGOs, or international non-governmental organizations, such as the Gates Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, Catholic Relief Services, and the Lutheran Relief Services. We also have CARE International. We also have transnational actors, TNAs, that are actually non-governmental organizations that participate in the global economy, which we will cover in depth at a later point in this lecture, but that emanate from a specific country and are thus tied to one national interest, such as the Anti-Defamation League of the United States, the Canadian Assembly of First Nations, or the Hungarian European Roma Rights Center. Why do we care? Why the intricate distinction? When studying the flow of power vis-a-vis domestic, foreign, or global economies, it's good to know who has the power. Is it still national governments? Or is it transnational actors? Transnational governments, whether democratic, autocratic, or theocratic, all usually have a boss to answer to. What of transnational actors, TNAs? To whom are they accountable? Politics is power. Power is central to the study of politics, and politics is nothing but the struggle for power. What, then, is power? Power is the ability to influence the behavior of others in accordance to one's own end. Or, in other words, how to get somebody to do what you want them to do. By the possession of power, we mean the capacity to centralize, regulate, or direct the behavior of persons or things. But then, what is force? Is power and force synonymous? What is the difference between power and force, or are they one and the same? Force is power made manifest. Force means the direction, limitation, closure, or total elimination of alternatives to the social action of one person or group by another person or group. Let's look at it this way. Power has key characteristics. Power is the capacity to influence the behavior of others, but power is often situational. For example, as a teacher, I have some kinds of power over students as students while they are taking my course. I can direct a student to read a book or to write a paper or to encourage them to think critically about an issue. However, my power ends when you're done with my class. I have no power once our situational association has ended. This is important to remember as we continue our studies in this course. As countries develop domestic policy or consider foreign policy, any actual power they have or any power they hope to express is always situational in relation to transnational actors and issues. Well, heck, let's also define economy as well, just so we're all on the same page. The word economy comes to us from the late 15th century, or the 1400s, from the French économie via the Latin from the Greek oikonomia, or household management. The current sense of the word comes from the 17th century, which is the state of a country or region in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services and the supply of money. Although divergent beliefs are held as to the direction and strength of the relationship of politics and economics, investigating their connection is the stuff of political economy. An academic discipline is a branch of knowledge taught and researched as a part of higher education. Some people believe that political science, as an academic discipline, pays insufficient attention to how economic processes and structures might influence the play of power and thus of the development of domestic policy. Likewise, the study of the economy is not just a function of supply and demand, as many professional economists might have us believe, because the economy does not function in a political vacuum. Political economy is not simply an amalgam or a combination of the two traditional fields. Rather, it attempts a new synthesis. IPE is a compilation of academic disciplines. Political science as an academic discipline is a social science which deals with systems of governance and the analysis of political activities, political thoughts, and political behavior. It examines the distribution of power and resources. We political scientists see ourselves engaged in revealing the relationships underlying political events and conditions, and from these revelations we attempt to construct general principles about the way the world of politics works. Economics is also a social science, and it studies the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Economics focuses on the behavior and interactions of economic agents and how economies work. For example, microeconomics analyzes basic elements in the economy, including individual agents and markets, their interactions, and the outcomes of their interactions. Macroeconomics analyzes the entire economy, meaning its aggregated production, consumption, saving and investment. It also examines issues affecting the economy, including unemployment of resources, whether that be labor, capital, or land, as well as inflation, economic growth, and the public domestic policies that address these issues. But IPE doesn't stop with political science and economics. It also includes historiography, or the study of history. That is a window into the past that provides understanding of the present day and how individuals, nations, and the global economy might develop in the future. Historical study instructs how societies came to be and examines cultural, political, social, and economic influences over time. IPE also includes sociology, which is the study of society, patterns of social relationships, social interactions, and the culture of everyday life. It is a social science that uses various methods of empirical investigation and critical analysis to develop a body of knowledge about social order, acceptance, and change or social evolution. Furthermore, IPE involves philosophy, the study of general and fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, values, reason, mind, and language. Historically, philosophy encompassed any body of knowledge. From Aristotle through Isaac Newton, philosophy encompassed astronomy, medicine, physics. In the modern era, the growth of modern research universities led academic philosophy and other disciplines to professionalize and specialize. In the modern era, then, some investigations that were traditionally part of philosophy became separate academic disciplines, including, are you ready? Psychology, sociology, linguistics, history, politics, and economics. As Robert Gilpin pointed out in his wonderful work, Global Political Economy, many mainstream economists frequently use the term political economy pejoratively to refer to the self-serving behavior of individuals and groups in the determination of public policy. According to this thought, national policy is most frequently the result of private groups' efforts to employ public means to further their own private interests rather than the result of selfless efforts to advance the commonwealth. And so rational choice theory, an economics theory, adequately describes the political action. Economic policy, this position argues, is the outcome of politics and competition among powerful groups for private advantage. For example, private interests lobbying for tariffs and other obstructions to free trade can best be understood as an attempt to use the public policy process for private gain. Likewise, many mainstream political scientists believe the discipline of economics has become too formal, too mathematical, too abstract. The study of economics as the development of formal models, many charge, has become largely irrelevant to the understanding and solving of real social and economic problems. A major reason for this isolation of economics from the real world, they argue, is that economics neglects the historical, political, and social settings in which economic behavior takes place. As a consequence, some assert that economics, at least as it is taught and practiced in traditional academic courses, has little relevance to the larger society and its needs. Economics and political economy differ significantly in their view of the role of the market in economic affairs and of the relationship of the market to other aspects of society. Whereas neoclassical economics and political economy differ significantly in their view of the role of the market in economic affairs and of the relationship of the market to other aspects of society. Whereas neoclassical economists believe that the market is autonomous, self-regulating, and governed by its own laws, almost all political economists assume that markets are embedded in larger sociopolitical structures that determine, to a considerable extent, the role and functioning of markets in social and political affairs, and that the social, political, and cultural environment significantly influences the purpose of economic activities and determines the boundaries within which markets necessarily must function. So, to put it in a nutshell, economists regard an economy as a market composed of impersonal economic forces. But specialists in political economy interprets it as a socio-political system populated by powerful actors. Many scholars refer to these schools of thought as ideologies because of the tenacity with which adherents maintain intellectual commitments even in the face of contrary logic or evidence. This suggests a powerful aversion to theoretical change. However, as we will examine during the course of our studies today, significant revision has occurred in IPE. Much of this is due to criticisms generated within one school of thought or another. For example, reappraisals of imperialism and dependency theory have, by and large, been the result of debates among Marxist scholars. On the other hand, inter-theory dialogue, for all its inherent difficulties, has also led to theoretical revision. For example, a lively debate has raged between liberal proponents of interdependence and neo-mercantilists, an exchange that has brought greater sophistication to each. Reasonable and practical people often argue over the most abstract of subjects, for domestic and foreign policy decisions sometimes rest upon the most intricate of theories. One of these debates took place during the 18th century, and from it emerged the foundations of modern economics. The question at issue was the ultimate source of national wealth, which some saw in trade, others saw in agriculture, and still others in human labor. Although the issue may seem, at first glance, to be devoid of practical or political significance, the whole range of government economic policy depended on the outcome. When you look at the history of the U.S. Senate or the creation of the Electoral College, you need look no further than a philosophical group known as the Physiocrats. We'll get to that. This was not always the case. Only 250 years ago, there were no economists known as such, and economic theory was a branch of moral philosophy. Economics, as we know it today, hardly existed, and what did exist was called political economy, indicating that it was a part of national policy more than anything else, and it dealt with such matters as taxes, public debts, and foreign trade. A common definition of scholasticism is the broad range of economic thought from Aristotle through Roman law through to the late medieval period and the early Renaissance and the birth of nationalism in the 14th and 15th centuries, when we begin to note its evolution into mercantilism, realism, and statism. As Daniel Fussfeld points out in his excellent examination of the topic, a book I highly recommend, The Age of the Economist, the Middle Ages, the era from the breakdown of the ancient Roman Empire to the mid-15th century in Europe, were not without trade, commerce, and markets, but the trade was, in large part, a long-distance and inter-regional trade in luxury products consumed by the wealthy. Peasant communities, rural and largely self-sufficient, produced a surplus to pay to the lord in products, in labor, and sometimes in cash. This surplus was the basis for purchases of luxuries by the church and the aristocracy, such as fine textiles, cloth, metal products, wine, and other items of the good life. A dual economy grew up, comprising the peasant village on the one hand and the commercial town on the other. It was a regulated economy of organized groups, such as manor, town, and guild, rather than one that operated through free decisions freely negotiated. In its fundamental structure, it was much like the economic system that prevailed through the Near and Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Far East. The great transformation of Europe to a market economy began in the 15th century. The geographical discoveries of the 15th and 16th centuries opened tremendous opportunities for trade and commerce, and set in motion a large flow of capital into Europe in the form of gold and silver treasures from both the New World and the East. The rise of national states largely destroyed the political power of two bulwarks of the old order, the nobility and the church. New methods of warfare used by these emerging rulers, featuring paid armies and large navies, required money and administration. National tax systems emerged, and a flow of purchasing power from taxpayer through government and back to the public further stimulated the growth of markets. The new economy generated new attitudes. Medieval people, accustomed to thinking and acting in traditional ways, gave way to market-oriented people who would sink or swim by virtue of their individual decisions. The successful ones were those who saved, who plowed profits back into the enterprise, who calculated prices and costs carefully, and who took risks in order to make gains. In short, there was little place for the attitudes of feudal warfare and jousting. The future law with commercial profits and commercial wealth. The future lay with commercial profits and commercial wealth. The older medieval point of view had subordinated economic life to both individual salvation and the needs of society. Theologians had argued that earthly life was merely a prelude to eternity, and moral laws had to prevail in all aspects of human endeavor. This meant that in all human relationships, including the economic, an individual had to keep the law of God continually in mind. The church knew that people must eat and clothe and house themselves, that the ordinary functions of production and distribution had to be carried on, but those functions had to be placed in proper perspective. Salvation was the proper business of life, and one must never forget it. Seeking wealth for its own sake was sinful, since it took one's attention away from salvation and pursuit of the moral life. By the 13th century, three closely related ideas had been deployed by the scholastics, the Catholic philosophers and professors who taught in the universities of the day. One idea, popular in Central Europe, identified the just or morally correct price of a commodity as that which would provide for the continued reproduction of the social order. It would return to the producer just enough to provide for the necessities of life and maintenance of the family, and to the merchant just enough profit to continue in trade. The buyer, meanwhile, would obtain needed goods without depriving the seller of the income necessary to continue in trade or production. The economic attitudes embodied in the orthodox moral philosophy of the Middle Ages can be summed up in a famous parable. A monk on a pilgrimage to Rome purchased a silver chalice for his church. Traveling back home with a band of merchants, he showed them the vessel and told what he had paid for it. The merchants congratulated him on his purchase, telling him that he had bought it for far less than its true value, and laughed that an unworldly monk would drive such a better bargain than any of them. Horrified, the monk left immediately, made his way back to Rome, and paid the seller of the chalice enough to make up the fair price. It was the only moral thing to do. The rise of a market economy created a moral dilemma for the people of the early modern era. On the one hand, the ethical teachings of religion told them that everyone was morally responsible for others. These ideas were found in the Old Testament story of Cain and Abel, and in the New Testament parable of the Good Samaritan. On the other hand, survival and success in a market economy required that each person try to outreach, outsmart, and overcome others. Well, all that's about to change. Mercantilism is the economic theory that trade generates wealth and is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances, which a government should encourage by means of protectionism. The mercantilist theorists were the first to take the field in the study of political economics. These writers were concerned with the national states that developed during the 16th and 17th centuries. They faced two different but related problems, one internal and one external. As cited before, David Fussfeld goes on to say that the internal or domestic problem was one of unity. National power had to be built up from, created out of, the hyper-localism of the Middle Ages. People didn't think nationally at this point. They thought of their village or town, possibly of their city, and only rarely of a larger region. For the economy to work as a national instrument, this had to change. This meant a unified monetary system and coinage, a national system of weights and measures, elimination of internal tolls on roads and rivers, and a national system of taxes and tariffs. These institutions, which today we take for granted, were slowly forged by national rulers against the opposition of feudal lords who tried to keep as much control as possible over the economy of their regions. The building of a national economy was predicated on the growing political power of the monarchs against the great nobles. Slide titled, The Transformation of Global Geopolitics. As I describe in my book, The Transformation of Global Geopolitics, new kingdoms and powerful new states were being welded together in the 16th century by a series of dynamic and politically powerful princes, and the 16th century was witness to the beginning of the nation-state. England, France, Spain, and Portugal began their rise to power. Later in the 17th century, the appearance of a growing number of powerful rulers quickens the pace towards consolidation of many European countries as we know them today. Actually, the new nation-state was to a large extent the expansion and growth of a number of very successful city-states which through marriage, intrigue, an excellent army, or through the cold steel will of their autocratic leaders, were able to aggrandize the territories and lands of lesser nobles who, throughout much of the medieval period, were strong enough to resist their encroachments. The 16th and 17th century autocrats were typically rulers of a major city like London or Paris, which previously had had insufficient power or ability to force their vassal dukes or barons to heel to their dictates. The 16th and 17th century see a quickening reversal of this relationship. A brief catalogue of the famous autocrats of that era will illustrate the extent of the move towards centripetal power and the concentration of political strength in a centralized nation-state. Louis XIV began his reign in France in 1643. Pope Alexander VI, Borgia, reigns in Rome from 1492. We all know the infamous Henry VIII of England, who rules from 1509. Charles V becomes Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 1520. Peter the Great becomes Tsar of Russia in 1689, and Frederick the Great rules Prussia beginning in 1740. These men were powerful, forceful, hungry personalities who crushed their opponents with a wanton frenzy which still captures our imagination. They were dictators who committed high crimes of murder, violence, and intrigue, and used every means at their disposal to expand their power and control. Louis XIV of France spent virtually his entire life in a spirited foreign policy attacking his neighbors in an effort to enlarge the territory of France. Frederick the Great of Prussia did likewise and was the prime mover in a tripartite conspiracy with Russia and Austria to dismember Poland. Nonetheless, despite the maneuverings of these ruthless, pitiless tyrants, history was accomplishing its eternal goal of consolidating the people of Europe into ever larger and larger political formations, nation-states. Imagine medieval Europe with its hundreds and hundreds of small political entities spread throughout the continent's landscape. Now let's read what the famous English historian Edward Gibbon has to say about the condition of Europe in 1780. Germany now has 2,300 walled towns. The Christian kingdoms of Denmark and Sweden have been successfully established, and the merchants with the Teutonic Knights have extended their colonies along the coast of the Baltic as far as the Gulf of Finland. From the Gulf of Finland to the Eastern Ocean, the Pacific, Russia now assumes the powerful form of a civilized empire. Europe is now divided into 12 powerful, though unequal kingdoms, 3 respectable commonwealths, and a variety of smaller, though independent states. During the span of years, then, from 1509 to 1789, kings, monarchs, popes, czars, and various other autocrats were gaining the upper hand in their respective countries. It's safe to say the theory of mercantilism is one of the great whipping boys in the history of economics. The school which dominated European thought between the 16th and 18th centuries is now considered no more than a historical artifact, and no self-respecting economist would describe themselves as a mercantilist. The dispatching of mercantilist doctrine is one of the foundation stones of modern economics. Ah, but is it? As described in a recent Economist magazine discussion, at the heart of mercantilism is the view that maximizing net exports is the best route to national prosperity. The idea that only one true measure of a country's wealth and success was the amount of gold that it had. If one country had more gold than another, it was necessarily better off. This idea had important consequences for economic policy. The best way of ensuring a country's prosperity was to make few imports and many exports, thereby generating a net flow of foreign exchange and maximizing the country's gold stocks. Does that sound at all familiar? Such ideas were attractive to some governments. Accumulating gold was thought to be necessary for a strong, powerful state. Countries such as Britain implemented policies which were designed to protect its traders and maximize income. The Navigation Acts, which severely restricted the ability of other nations to trade between England and its colonies, were one such example. And there are some amusing and interesting stories of mercantilism in action. During the Napoleonic Wars, the warring governments made few attempts to prevent their foes from importing food and then thereby starving them. But they did try to make it difficult for their opponent to export goods. Fewer exports would supposedly result in economic chaos as gold supplies dwindled. Ensuring an absence of gold, rather than an absence of grub or food, was perceived to be the most devastating way to grind down the enemy. But there is an important distinction between mercantilist practice and mercantilist thought. The opinions of thinkers were often mangled when they were translated into policies. And a paper by William Gramp, published in 1952, offers a more subtle account of mercantilism. Mr. Gramp concedes that mercantilists were keen on foreign trade. One often reads in mercantilist tomes that foreign trade would be more beneficial than would domestic trade, and some of the early mercantilists were enchanted by the idea of an overflowing treasure chest. This only worked as long as the trade balance was in the nation-state's favor. Mercantilism is thought to have begun its intellectual eclipse with the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776. A simple interpretation of the economic history suggests that Smith's ruthless advocacy for free markets was squarely opposed to regulation-heavy mercantilist doctrine. Nicholas Phillipson, who recently wrote a biography of Smith, argues that the notion of free markets was actually alien to the father of economics. Smith made it clear that governments would always play a part in making markets, and could not conceive of a market where the government did not play a crucial role. In this sense, Smith's contribution does not represent such a sharp break from mercantilist thought. The question was not whether, but how much of a role the state would play. Though most of the world's rich countries remain committed to free trade today, and to globalization as we'll discuss in a future lecture, mercantilist themes are often found in today's economic policy debates. China and Germany are often envied for their trade surpluses or seen as economic models, and China especially has very deliberately subsidized its exports. This zero-sum way of looking at the global economy is less rooted in the national greatness side of mercantilism than in the focus on full employment, at a time when many rich economies are suffering from insufficient demand and high rates of joblessness. Again, as Robert Gilpin points out, the foremost strength of economic nationalism is its focus on the state as the predominant actor in international relations and as an instrument of economic development. Although many have argued that modern economic and technological developments have made the nation-state an anachronism, and at the end of the 20th century, the system of nation-states is actually expanding. Societies throughout the world are seeking to create stronger states, capable of organization and managing national economies. And the number of states in the world is increasing. Even in older states, the spirit of national sentiments can be easily inflamed. Although other actors, such as transnational and international organizations, do exist and do influence international relations, the economic and military efficiency of the state makes it preeminent over all these other actors. Educated souls to identify a physiocrat, only a couple can help you out. As C.W. London points out in a recent Economist article, physiocrats are not household names, unlike Adam Smith or David Ricardo, but they are important. According to one late 19th century historian, the physiocrats, who sometimes called themselves economists, created the first strictly scientific system of economics. Physiocracy was a theory of wealth. The physiocrats believed that the wealth of nations was derived solely from the value of agriculture. Understanding of value added to agriculture was rather primitive. Physiocrats could not see, for example, how manufacturing could create wealth. Farmers, on the other hand, could. As Karl Marx explains in Das Kapital, the physiocrats insist that only agricultural labor is productive, since that alone, they say, yields a surplus value. The physiocrats were most commonly known for these simplistic economic ideas. But this was not their most important contribution to economic thought. Rather, it was the physiocrats' methodological approach to economics that was revolutionary. Before physiocracy, economics was not a very scientific discipline. As we discussed, mercantilist thinkers sometimes assumed that amassing gold was the best economic strategy. Economic efficiency was a pretty alien idea. Francois Quesnay was a scientist for most of his life. He was a medical doctor as well. And he wanted to apply the scientific principles of medicine to the study of wealth. The tableau économique, which shows in a single page how an entire economy functions, is Quesnay's most famous contribution. Quesnay showed that the economy was something to be respected, analyzed, and understood, much like a human body. It cannot simply be molded to suit the will of a self-important monarch. This was a hugely important step forward. The Comte de Mirabeau, an important figure during the Revolution, considered Quesnay's tableau to be one of the world's three great discoveries, equaled only by the invention of printing and the discovery of money. Familiar notions of contemporary liberal economics derive from Quesnay's scientific approach. The physiocrats, like many other thinkers in the 18th century, subscribed to the idea of a natural order. They showed that unchanging laws governed all economic processes. Consequently, it is generally thought that the physiocrats were opposed to government intervention. The dead hand of the state would only corrupt the natural evolution of the economy. A good example of the physiocrats' new scientific approach to economics is found in the writings of a little-known disciple, Louis-Paul Abiel. Abiel, writing in the 1760s, discussed the grain trade. He opposed mercantilist ideas of what to do during a period of food scarcity, for example, after a bad harvest. Received wisdom suggested that during a period of scarcity, a government should step in and forcibly lower the price of grain so that people could afford to buy it. Governments might also choose to ban grain exports. But Abiel argued that government intervention in the grain trade was self-defeating. With lower prices, he argued, grain producers would produce less. They would also make less profit, and therefore have less money to invest in the next year's harvest. Government intervention, in other words, would disrupt the efficient working of the free market in grain, which would ultimately turn scarcity into a famine. So he argued that government should step back and let local prices rise. Producers in other parts of the country would respond to the high prices, and the area would soon be flooded with grain. Problem solved. But Abiel recognized that there would be a time lag between the price rise and the demand response. And so, according to some writers, the implication of Abiel's argument is that people who cannot afford grain should be allowed to die. Efficient economic management trumped humanitarianism. Unsurprisingly, Many writers criticize the physiocrats for their dogmatism. Adam Smith, in an amusing passage toward the end of his Wealth of Nations, reckoned that they were carried away by the desire for perfection. Smith, aware that Quesnay was a medical doctor, argued that some speculative physicians have imagined that the health of the human body could be preserved only by a certain precise regimen of diet and exercise, of which the smallest violation necessary occasions some degree of disease or disorder. However, the human body frequently preserves, to all appearances at least, in the most perfect state of health under a vast variety of different regimens. Mr. Quesnay seems to have entertained a notion of the same kind concerning the political body. Smith reckoned that the physiocrats wanted a perfect system of laissez-faire economic management, or no system at all. As we will discuss further herein, many of our founding generation were physiocrats, predominantly Thomas Jefferson. Their impact is significant on the creation of our form of government, namely the balance between the urban and the rural elements of our nation as crafted into the Constitution. Now, albeit Jefferson was the ambassador to France and Adams the ambassador to England during the Constitutional Convention, nevertheless, their influence on the founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention was significant. The physiocrats really are a misinterpreted bunch. Much of their economic theory is rather useless, but their approach to the study of economics was an invaluable contribution, and unlike much academic economics today, their fascination with abstract models did not make them as inflexible and authoritarian as many believe. In his book on political economy, David Balam best describes classic liberalism as a broad term, meaning liberty under the law. Liberalism focuses on the side of human nature that is competitive in a constructive way, and is guided by reason, not by emotions. Although liberals believe that people are fundamentally self-interested, they do not see this as a disadvantage because competing interests in a society can engage one another constructively. This contrasts with the mercantilist view discussed before, which dwells on the side of human nature that is more aggressive, combative, and suspicious. Classic economic liberalism is rooted in reactions to important trends in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. François Quesnay, who led a group of French physiocrats, condemned government interference in the market, holding that, with few exceptions, it brought harm to society. The physiocrats' motto was laissez-faire, laissez-passer, meaning let it be, let it pass. But said in the spirit of telling the state, hey, hands off, leave us alone. This because the theme of Adam Smith, a Scottish contemporary of Quesnay, who is generally regarded as the father of modern economics. Smith, and many since him, including David Ricardo, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman, admire the market, even while recognizing its abusive potential. Slide titled Adam Smith. In his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, Smith opposed the mercantilist state of the 18th century, established on the principle that the nation is best served when state power is used to create wealth and thereby national security. He criticized Britain's Parliament for representing the interests of the landed gentry and monopolistic trading corporations, not those of the entrepreneurs and citizens of the growing industrial centers. For classic economic liberals, individual freedom in the marketplace leads to an efficient allocation of resources and helps reduce potentially abusive state power. Most importantly, a commercial society should produce rising living standards for all members of society. Smith believed in the cooperative, constructive side of human nature. For him, the best interest of all society is served by rational individual choices, which, when observed from afar, appear as an invisible hand that guides the economy and promotes the common good. When economists say that competition regulates economic activity, they are referring to the ways in which markets convert the pursuit of consumer self-interest into an outcome that inevitably benefits all of society. According to Smith, the pursuit of individual self-interest does not lead to civil disorder or even anarchy. Rather, self-interest serves society's interests. Smith famously said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages." In a capitalist economy, self-interest drives individuals to make rational choices that best serve their own needs and desires. However, it is competition that constrains and disciplines self-interest and prevents it from being destructive to the interests of others. Under ideal circumstances, producers must compete with others, which forces them to charge reasonable prices and provide quality goods to their customers or lose business. Consumers also face competition from other consumers who may be willing to pay more for a product. Even if producers might want to push prices high and buyers might want to push prices low, the force of competition keeps the pursuit of self-interest from going to the extreme. Smith recognized that the state has some necessary and legitimate functions in society, such as defending the country, policing, building public works, preventing the spread of disease, enforcing contracts, and helping to achieve individual rights. Smith was also quite adamant in his distrust of business people. One of his famous quotes is that people of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment or diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. The pursuit of self-interest by a monopoly producer, for example, often leads to restricted output, higher prices for goods, and a consequent loss of social welfare. Smith also distrusted bankers and noted that employers always sought to keep wages low. Smith believed that merchants and trading companies often had disproportionate influence over the parliament and compressed their private interests. They easily influenced the legislature to establish licenses, franchises, tariffs, and quota that restricted competition. Often, their trading companies gained the sole right to see products, keeping market prices far above the natural price. We see a similar dynamic today in the success of corporations in pushing governments to strengthen patents, which are legal, temporary monopolies on inventions allowing their owners to prevent others from using their inventions without their permission. Because patents limit competition, corporations can sometimes reap exorbitant profits from the goods covered by such patents. While Smith opposed having the state try to direct investments because it might be counterproductive and unnecessary, he supported the state exercising vigilance, enforcing competition policies, and helping the market work properly. Today we would say that in capitalist economies, Smith opposed the manipulation of the market to reward powerful business interests. For Smith, the market's invisible hand cannot work for the benefit of all society if there isn't competition. He viewed the state as necessary to prevent capitalists themselves from destroying the market, and he recognized that powerful political interests could use the state to create an unfair market. In his often overlooked book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith argued that in a properly structured market, commercial activity would produce righteous and prudent people. Even as people pursue their self-interests, their passions are restrained by competition that induces them to serve the interests of others, to behave honestly, and to gain a reputation for fairness. In a world of intense competition, commercial society was a way to channel self-interest into a less morally corrupt society than during feudalism. Smith believed that as the labor force grew in size, the welfare of servants and laborers and workmen of different kinds should be the prime concern of economic policy. He insisted that no society can surely be flourishing or happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Smith was convinced that a commercial society, what today we call capitalism, with competition, a division of labor, and good governance, would tend to produce universal opulence such that even lowest classes would have a significantly higher standard of living. Noted Nobel Prize-winning economist F.A. Hayek says, "During the whole of this modern period of European history, the general direction of social development was one of freeing the individual from ties which had bound him to the customary or prescribed ways in the pursuit of his ordinary activities. The conscious realization that the spontaneous and uncontrolled efforts of individuals were capable of producing a complex order of economic activities would come only after this development had made some progress. The subsequent elaboration of a consistent argument in favor of economic freedom was the outcome of a free growth of economic activity which had been the undesigned and unforeseen byproduct of political freedom." In a nutshell, capitalism is a political and economic system where the industry and trade for a country are controlled through private ownership. Profits are generated by this ownership instead of the control being mandated by the government. There are specific characteristics of capitalism which make it a unique type of economic system. It combines the elements of voluntary exchange with capital accumulation, private property ownership, competitive markets, and pricing systems. Wage labor is included in this economy as well. Decisions are made by the owner of wealth in a society based on capitalism. If you own property or production capability, then you have wealth. Although there are different ways to apply these concepts, capitalism always comes back to private ownership over public ownership. Here are the critical points to consider when looking at the advantages and disadvantages of capitalism today. 1. Capitalism naturally promotes equality for each person in the society. What is unique about capitalism is that everyone is provided with the same chance to find success. Not everyone may achieve their definition, but it doesn't change the starting point for each person. No matter what a household's socioeconomic status happens to be, there is an opportunity for them to pursue their goals, achieve financial success, and chart their own course. If you're willing to work hard, then you've got the same shot as everyone else. 2. It also creates more opportunities for innovation. In the world of capitalism, competition is what leads to profits. When you have the best product in your industry, then you'll likely have the most customers. That means companies and individuals are constantly working toward innovative ideas, services, and products which better the lives of everyone. Although there is no guarantee of success at the individual level, there is nothing which stops people from trying multiple times to succeed either. Everything that is produced is intended to help others in some way. 3. Free market systems are allowed to develop under capitalism. Instead of having governments interfere with pricing, product availability, or taxation value, capitalism places the focus of each product and service on the individual. Pricing is driven by demand for that product. Supplies are pushed upward or downward based on a need response. Within this type of society, each person is naturally provided with the opportunity to choose what they believe will meet their needs in the best possible way. No one dictates what they must purchase or how much they must spend. 4. Self-regulation occurs naturally in an economy powered by capitalism. Because capitalism is governed by the rules of supply and demand, providers of goods and services are encouraged to be good actors in society. If they mislead consumers about the quality or problem-solving ability of what they sell, then they'll go out of business fast. If products are unsafe, they won't be purchased. That encourages self-regulation to occur because a business which wants to stay operational must always be focused on meeting the exact needs of their future customers. 5. Capitalism is not without compassion. Some people believe that capitalism is a self-centered type of society because the focus primarily is on oneself. This is not always the case. People develop goods and services to solve problems. That's how you make money in such a society. To gain the attention of potential consumers, you must proactively help other people to prove what you have created will actually work. Although the purpose of doing this work is certainly self-motivated, compassion is dictated in capitalism because the only way to make money is by helping other people in some way. 6. There is a focus on individual skills in capitalist society. Even though capitalism is often approached in a nationalist sense, it really is more of a globalist idea. The G20 will almost always accept immigration applications from people who have needed skills or perspectives. If you work hard enough, no matter where you happen to live in the world, then you're going to be given an opportunity. You can take what you learn to bring it back home, improving local conditions along the way. Even with its emphasis on the individual, capitalism brings the world together in a way that is unique. To be fair, there are surely disadvantages to capitalism as well. 1. A lack of consumption destroys the foundation of capitalism. If people decide to save their money instead of spending it, then capitalism struggles to survive. People must be buying and selling goods and services for the economy to grow. Purchasing is what creates jobs for others. When more people are driven to purchase something specific, it creates new opportunities for growth. That's why wealth accumulation at the top 1% of society can create shortages of income for the entry-level worker. 2. A first fair chance is not the same as ongoing equal opportunities. The amount of wealth a person or their household controls will dictate the number of chances they have for success. With enough wealth, your chances are infinite. If you're born into a household that is below the poverty line, you might get one chance to find the success you want. Just because capitalism offers everyone the same first chance doesn't mean that it's a fair system. For many, the opportunities to chase dreams are momentary at best. 3. If you can't produce, then capitalism says you get left behind. It is up to each household to care for the people who are unable to care for themselves. In a true society based on capitalism, if you're unable to support yourself in some way, there is no responsibility to provide services or support. It doesn't matter if you were born with a disability or someone purposely injured you to stop working. You must be essential to the survival of the society to be important. 4. Capitalism changes the emphasis on governing. Because the state doesn't control business in a capitalist society, it must generate income from other resources. That is why taxation is a common element in this type of society. Private businesses have one large expense: labor. Because they are constantly forced to innovate, their allocation of resources is always taken away from jobs where it is a threat to their existence. Then the government taxes the profits of individuals and businesses to provide social services. At the end of the day, it is the worker who is at most risk in this society, not the business or government. 5. Capitalism creates the need to monopolize. As new businesses try to sell goods or services to consumers, the largest companies in each industry pay attention. They'll purchase companies through mergers and acquisitions to limit the number of competitors that would disrupt their pricing mechanisms. The goal is always the same: monopolization. If a company can monopolize a market, then it can set its own price for goods and services, which reduces consumer choice instead of increasing it. When there are anti-monopoly laws in place, it could be argued that the society is not following a true capitalist model. 6. Business can become too big to fail. Governments support the wealthiest individuals and the largest companies with assets and subsidies because they are the driver of society. That practice can lead to a misuse of funds, poor investment decisions, and other financial issues that affect everyone in society. During the recession years of 2007 to 2009, the United States offered bailouts to several companies to prevent them from going under because of the detrimental consequences that the society as a whole would endure if that happened. If you earn $60,000 a year and your company goes bankrupt, your best option is an unemployment ruling in your favor. 7. Capitalism can create a race to the bottom for wages. Although businesses survive when they cater to the needs of their core demographics, that rule doesn't apply to the labor force. Wages often stagnate in times of economic decline because businesses recognize that someone with similar skills will do the same work as their current employees for a smaller paycheck. When good economic times return, the worst-case scenario is that the new employees get paid at the same level as the previous employees. then the cycle can repeat itself during the next downturn of the economy. That's why middle-class wages in the United States are lower than they were in 1980 when looking at the value of spending power. It is true that the advantages and disadvantages of capitalism encourage societal development. This societal structure pushes innovation, encourages strength, and embraces compassion. It can also cause people to focus on wealth accumulation and personal consumption. That is why societies that are based on these principles are often regulated. Once that regulation occurs, however, it could be said that such a society is no longer capitalistic. That's the catch-22 of this structure. By 1936, the whole direction and emphasis of modern economics was transformed by the appearance of a single book. Its forbidding title was The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and it was written by the most controversial English economist of the time, John Maynard Keynes. It dealt with crucial problems of employment and unemployment at a time when the world economy was in the grip of the most disastrous and widespread depression it had ever experienced. Although many people had given up hope of ever rebuilding worldwide prosperity and a viable economic system, Keynes' book offered a theoretical analysis diagnosing that the patient is seriously ill, but not beyond the hope of prescribing remedies that could restore its health. Keynes' general theory revolutionized the way economists think about economics. It was path-breaking in several ways, in particular because it introduced the notion of aggregate demand as the sum of consumption, investment, and government spending, and because it showed, or purported to show, that full employment could be maintained only with the help of government spending. Economists still argue about what Keynes thought caused high unemployment. Some think he attributed it to wages that take a long time to fall, but Keynes actually wanted wages not to fall, and in fact advocated in the general theory that wages be kept stable. A general cut in wages, he argued, would decrease income, consumption, and aggregate demand. This would offset any benefits to output that the lower price of labor might have contributed. Why shouldn't government, thought Keynes, fill the shoes of business by investing in public works and hiring the unemployed? The general theory advocated deficit spending during economic downturns to maintain full employment. Keynes' conclusion initially met with opposition. At the time, balanced budgets were the standard practice of the government. But the idea soon took hold in the U.S. government, and the U.S. government put people back to work on public works projects. Of course, once policymakers had taken deficit spending to heart, they couldn't let it go. Contrary to some of his critics' assertions, Keynes was a relatively strong advocate of free markets. It was Keynes, not Adam Smith, who said there is no objection to be raised against the classical analysis of the manner in which private self-interest will determine what in particular is produced, in what proportions the factors of production will be combined to produce it, and how the value of the final product will be distributed between them. Keynes believed that once full employment had been achieved by fiscal policy measures, the market mechanism could then operate freely. Thus, he continues, apart from the necessity of central controls to bring about an adjustment between the propensity to consume and the inducement to invest, there is no more reason to socialize economic life than there was before. So, Keynesian economics takes the idea of priming the pump, allowing government to spend to jumpstart a sputtering economy, while lowering interest rates to allow freer borrowing and thus spending. The Roosevelt Institute notes that Franklin Roosevelt began his 1932 campaign for the presidency espousing orthodox fiscal beliefs and believed that a balanced budget was important to instill confidence in consumers, business, and the markets, which would thus encourage investment and economic expansion. But as the severity of the Great Depression became clear, he recognized that emergency relief programs were a necessity no matter the cost. Before the advent of his work, the prevailing point of view among economists and policymakers was that recessions in a private capitalist economy were essentially self-correcting. They argued that if there were more goods and services in the economy than could be sold, prices and wages would fall and restore balance. Keynes' insight was that, for a host of reasons, this need not be, and often was not, the case. He suggested that fluctuations in output and employment were the consequence of changes in aggregate demand, and that it was possible for an economy to be trapped in a sustained period where private investment and consumption remained very low even with falling prices. Keynes provided several reasons as to why the actions of individuals and firms could yield outcomes in which the economy operated below its potential output and growth. Inherent institutional features of the system made prices adjust too slowly downwards. Businesses and households maintained pessimistic expectations, thereby holding back investment and consumptions. Individuals wanted to keep their assets in the most liquid of forms, thereby preventing long-term investments from incurring, and so on. In establishing these relationships, Keynes enabled the creation of the field of macroeconomics. But it was in the arena of policy and the role of the state in managing the economy that his ideas had the most public impact. In order to counter the tendencies that prolonged recessions and created depressions, Keynes proposed an active role for government intervention through monetary and fiscal policies to control the business cycle. When private spending was too low, governments could take up the slack and spend in order to maintain aggregate demand. Such policies greatly enabled the moderation of business cycles in the post-war period. As defined by the 1980s policies of United States President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, was a step away from Keynesian macro management of the economy and back to more classic free market parameters evidenced by lowering corporate taxes, reducing the size of government, reducing deficits, expansion of the money supply, and returning to a laissez-faire model of government influence in the free market. Reagan thought spending on military readiness would achieve much of the promised benefits of Keynesian pump priming, but in an area of the economy under the direct auspices of the government. Indeed, the rise in military spending under Reagan forced the Soviet Union to strive to match it, ruining their economy in the final analysis, and thus helping usher in the end of the Soviet Union and the close of the Cold War. Economically, however, it's been shown that military spending doesn't raise all boats, as Keynes would have predicted. Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, was not primarily interested in international political economy. His greatest work examined the genesis and internal dynamics of the capitalist mode of production. He commented upon the expansion of capital internationally as did Lenin, but his thoughts on the subject were not rigorously integrated into his general theory of capital. However, Lenin's discussion of the causes of capitalist expansion differs somewhat from Marx's broad historical analysis. Writing in the 20th century, Lenin stressed the uneven nature of capitalist development that leads to the necessity of exporting capital. From this premise, Lenin argues that imperialism is a distinct stage of capitalism because concentration and centralization of capital in some nations require the internationalization of that capital. This has crucial political consequences as the imperialist powers divide the world among themselves. As Marxism and the arguments for planned economies find little traction as a viable economic model, scholars now tend toward neo-Marxist emphasis, also known as structuralism. Structuralist economics is an approach to economics that emphasizes the importance of taking into account structural features when undertaking economic analysis. For example, as David Balam contends, structuralists reject the optimistic liberal interpretation of free trade and deregulated markets, asserting instead that the disparities in power between capitalists and workers, and rich and poor countries, produce exploitation, inequality, and poverty. The capitalist system tends to reproduce itself such that those who begin with more power and wealth are able to maintain that position at the expense of labor and the poor. Accumulation by dispossession transfers communal assets to private control while transferring the management of economics risks to individuals. Theories about imperialism, dependency, and modern world systems demonstrate that, given states' vastly unequal starting places, it would be naive to believe that free markets operate on a level playing field that will somehow lead to the end of poverty. This is because key states and international institutions are seen as largely responding to the pressure of transnational capitalist class, which seeks profits wherever they can be found. There are 5 structures within any given economy that are influenced by political forces. They include knowledge, whether viewed from a liberal, mercantilist, or structuralist perspective. Knowledge and technology form a critical basis of wealth and power. In this era of global competition, companies and policymakers understand that knowledge and technology confer significant advantages on countries. Governments have power to control flows of information across borders by, among other things, censoring the internet and requiring data localization. Conversely, they undermine those controls through often successful espionage against other governments, as WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden have revealed. Transnational corporations sometimes work hand in glove with governments to accumulate information on nationals and foreigners with important consequences for human rights. Cyber warfare. terrorism, climate change. Realists argue that with no global order and economic cooperation, there can be no security for nation-states. An important question today is whether the United States, Russia, China, and other major powers have the capacity and will to manage the current global security structure or construct a more stable and secure one. To achieve the goals of peace and security, states must cooperate and build trust. Because the global security structure is currently weak and war is so costly, the major powers have a strong incentive to reconfirm the old norms and establish new ones through a conscious and diligent multilateral process. Finance and monetary. Today's global political economy is much more integrated than it was 25 years ago. The continuing redistribution of wealth and political power has made it more difficult to manage the finance and monetary structure. Many states would like a truly multilateral institution to regulate finance and exchange rates and produce rules for handling debt that reflect the interests of debtors as much as creditors. Trade. The post-World War II trade structure led to progressive lowering of many barriers to trade in manufactured goods, greater convergence on trade norms and rules, and the peaceful resolution of many trade disputes. Trade liberalization has undoubtedly expanded global trade and increased competition to lower prices for many goods and services. At the same time, many barriers to trade in agricultural goods and services have remained, and the digital revolution is forcing states to negotiate new rules to govern the rapid expansion of trade and services that threaten vested interests in societies. The international trade system, which for more than 3 decades combined increased trade liberalization with politically managed trade relationships, is facing a strong challenge from nationalist and mercantilist political forces. The global production structure has undergone rapid change in the last few decades. Transnational corporations, TNCs, have been driven to invest abroad by the competitive environment found in transnational markets, the policy liberalization that encourages that competition, and the technological changes that make foreign investment more efficient. Although most foreign direct investment, FDI, flows between developed countries, a much larger proportion now ends up in developing countries, fueling industrialization in Asia and Latin America. Liberals view these changes as increasing global growth and benefiting consumers, yet nationalists and mercantilists worry that they are leading to a deindustrialization that hurts domestic workers and increases inequality in developed countries. There are 4 levels of analysis possible in examining the political nature of the economy. These include global, interstate, societal, and individual levels. David Balam defines the global level as the broadest, most comprehensive level of analysis. In this, we look at global economic constraints and opportunities that cannot be traced to any one state, group of states, individual, or group. Such elements might include technology, global markets, and the natural environment. He gives the example of the development and proliferation of standardized shipping containers that made outsourcing more viable because loading, unloading, and transportation of manufactured goods thereby became cheaper, faster, and easier. This new technology then helped change where production occurs in the world. Another good example is climate change, which is forcing a shift to new energy sources, thereby potentially hurting countries reliant on oil and coal, while rewarding countries that invest in solar power or other forms of non-petro-coal energy. At the international or interstate level, we analyze how the relationship between states affect global outcomes. Where do alliances and the balance of power between states shape what actions individual states can take and what threats they might face? The presence of a hegemon, one dominant world power, gives us global public goods such as security, free trade, and a top stable currency. The United States has acted as the world hegemon since the conclusion of the Second World War. The rise of new powers, such as China, lead to a conflict with that hegemony. How can a state who loosely regulates industry within its borders, allowing a more fruitful bottom line, affect the balance of trade vis-a-vis countries who strive to foster tighter regulations? I encourage everyone to think of CO2 emissions or other air or water pollutants. At the state societal level, we analyze how bureaucratic, domestic, political decision-making, what political scientists call policy development, and the type of government existing shapes outcomes. We also look through the lens of political science at lobbying and electoral pressures, and through sociology's lens at how a country's class structure determines its foreign policy. David Balam gives an example of the political power of farmers in the United States by virtue of the structure of representation in the Senate, where each state, regardless of population, has equal representation. This structure magnifies the power of the rural agricultural states, encouraging Congress to give large subsidies to American farmers, especially cotton, corn, and tobacco, and maintain high tariffs on imported agricultural commodities, all of which hurt farmers in poorer developing countries. Another example would be the heavy deregulation of Wall Street, due in part to the political power of brokers and banks, which allowed extending mortgages to some subprime borrowers, laying the foundation for the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. Finally, looking at political systems, whether a country's government has a presidential or a parliamentary system affects how that government will be able to negotiate trade agreements and tariffs. At this level, then, we examine what individual policymakers do to cause or influence events, the individual level. As example, we have Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chairman from 1987 to 2006, who, in his adherence to classic liberalism, insisted that the markets would self-regulate, thus shying away from addressing inherent systemic risks in financial systems that might have triggered national and economic crises. He has recently come out admitting that his adherence to this philosophy helped create the housing bubble and the subprime crisis. The Federal Reserve Chairman, as we'll note in later comments, is intended to be inured or sheltered from politics and political pressure. President Trump's tweet attacks on Fed Chair Jerome Powell for raising the prime interest rate is seen as a violation of this premise, while roughly two-thirds of Wall Street companies gave the Fed a score of 4 out of 5 for effectiveness. What's interesting is that since his inauguration in 2017, the Fed's steady rate hikes have added a cumulative $5.1 million a year to President Trump's service debt costs, raising the specter of a conflict of interest in his publicly attacking the ostensibly politically shielded Federal Reserve. Slide titled, "Why Should We Care?" A brief review of world history suggests that globalization is an ongoing process that has unfolded in the past in ways remarkably similar in form, if not content, to the present. For example, what the Europeans called the Age of Discovery was simply the globalization of its day. Columbus and his contemporaries were attempting to upgrade access to global markets, in their case by finding a faster route to India. They were able to attempt this because of technological innovations in the leading sectors of their economy. Back then, the development of cheaper, faster, sturdier ships enabled the flow of highly valued goods such as spices and gold. Today, the development of cheaper, faster, sturdier microelectronics enables the flow of highly prized information and dollars. The story of globalization at any age is a story of technological innovation leading to greater global integration. What has changed dramatically over time is how complex and extensive this web of interconnections has become. Issues that were once dealt with in isolation must be thought of now as being linked together and connected to other issues. For example, economic policies may have environmental impacts. Environmental policies may have social impacts. Social policies will have political ramifications, all of which are likely to affect the original economic condition that the economic policy was formulated to deal with in the first place. Where once states worried about the domestic consequences of their own domestic policies, they must now consider international, regional, and local impacts and reactions. There have been 3 tectonic power shifts over the last 500 years, fundamental changes in the distribution of power that have reshaped international life, its politics, economics, and culture. The first was the rise of the Western world, a process that began in the 15th century and accelerated dramatically in the late 18th century. It produced modernity as we know it, science, technology, commerce, and capitalism, the agricultural and industrial revolutions. It also produced the prolonged political dominance of the nations in the West. The second shift, which took place in the closing years of the 19th century, was the rise of the United States. Soon after it industrialized, the United States became the most powerful nation since Imperial Rome, and the only one that was stronger than any likely combination of other nations. For most of the last century, the United States has dominated global economics, power, science, politics, and culture. For the last 25 years, that dominance has been unrivaled, a phenomenon unprecedented in modern history. We are now living through the third great power shift of the modern era. It could be called the rise of the rest. Over the past few decades, countries all over the world have been experiencing rates of economic growth that were once unthinkable. Yes, while there have been booms and busts, the overall trend has been unambiguously upward. This growth has been most visible in Asia, but is no longer confined to it. It is why to call this shift the rise of Asia does not describe it accurately. In the past few years, 124 countries grew at a rate of 4% or more. That includes more than 30 countries in Africa, 2/3 of the continent. Of the 25 companies most likely to be the world's next great multinationals, 4 each are from Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, and Taiwan. 3 are from India, 2 from China, 1 each from Argentina, Chile, Malaysia, and South Africa. Look around. The tallest building in the world is now in Dubai, the second in Taipei. The world's richest man is Mexican, and its largest publicly traded corporation is Chinese. The world's biggest plane is built in Russia and Ukraine. Its leading refinery is in India, and its largest factories are all in China. By many measures, London is the leading financial center, and the United Arab Emirates is home to the most richly endowed investment fund. Once quintessentially American icons have been appropriated by foreigners. The world's largest casino is not in Las Vegas, but in Macau, which has overtaken Vegas in annual gambling revenues. The biggest movie industry, both in terms of movies made and tickets sold, is Bollywood, not Hollywood. Even shopping. Of the top 10 malls in the world, only 1 is in the United States. The world's biggest is in Beijing. And what of the United States? Whence our future in the age of globalization? As Fareed Zakaria points out in his book, The Post-American World, at the political-military level, we remain a hegemonic single superpower world. But in every other dimension, industrial, financial, educational, social, cultural, the distribution of power is shifting, moving away from American dominance. That does not mean we are entering an anti-American world. We are moving into a post-American world, one defined and directed from many places and by many people. Using the Trump administration's 2019 trade war with China as a relative case study, please describe IPE and its predominant perspectives, structures, and levels of analysis.